Well, last time we looked at an inner-outer kind of dualism, and we looked at it mostly from a viewpoint of pathological psychology, but we did look at it a little bit from cosmic creation. This time we're going to look at dualism in a different way, and probably for the next few times we'll look at dualism a different way each time, and hopefully at the end we'll have some general ideas of dualism as well as the little ones along the way. Zarathustra was something like a house prophet. That is, he lived right in the service of a king. It's described as a Chorasmanian king named Ishtaspa. Now, some scholars, modern ones, are tempted to say that the religion of Zoroastrianism is created in the service of the political ends of that king. From a mystical point of view, it does seem a little absurd to think that a very great spiritual source like that would be subdued to being something like a petty servant of worldly ambitions, but that's the way the world looks at it these days. But if we look at it from a mystical point of view, there might be something to it. Because in general, myth eventually, since it's the language of the spiritual creative source of all things, does indeed ripen into history, given the proper conditions, and those conditions are time, place, and people. And if that happens in general to be true, that the creative myth is the source of the creation, it should be true specifically, such that when the evolutionary needs of a collective group of people working together through a tool, something like a race or a culture, comes to a certain ripeness of age in time or in a certain place on the earth, you would expect that there would be a religion or a spiritual outlook that would be there to help them in their work. So Zarathustra might very well have been in the service of the divine and in the service of the people, helping them develop a culture that now, to appearances to the modern mind, looks like he was actually trying to control them for mere petty political ends. Political ambitions usually blind us to the spiritual reality that is behind things, and with that being the case, it would be very hard for someone like a prophet to be able to work through something like that to accomplish things. But we have to always remember that the phenomenon that we talked about last time of projection is something that is universally true. That there is an old occult maxim that goes that we always look through our own auras, such that when we project the light of consciousness out into the external world, either to create or to see what is there, it passes through the lens of our own psycho-spiritual makeup. And whatever we are is what we're going to see. And if our consciousness is polluted, and especially if it's polluted in a way that we have things etched right into the lens, we might see serpents in other people's auras or in other places that are really in ourselves. This is why spiritual teachers of all times have been so big about purity. And purity in this sense of the word does not mean some kind of preconception of living to a specific code of conduct, even though there might be objective codes of conduct, but purity meaning free from personal attachment, purity meaning freedom from presumption or assumption or prejudice or anything of that nature. We have a free choice to make our vehicles what they are, that is, to objectively produce them in such a way that they are what they are without bias and without something that tints or shades or in other ways distorts our view of reality. This kind of purity, I think, is probably one of the most important things in our entire spiritual development, because seeing what is there is such a large part of the spiritual life. One can almost be taken, I believe, for a prophet for just seeing what is just out there and being able to take note of it. But if we always have our own agenda about things and we're always having our personal attached desires to things and, so to speak, muck up our auras so that we can't see clearly, we can't even perceive when somebody else does see clearly. So it means very great choice on our part. In any case, it seems very unlikely that the becoming people of Persia were duped by a pet prophet that was something like a mouthpiece or an ideologue, something like a Goebbels, a political geographer, even though there is a lot of political geography in Zoroastrianism, to a petty tyrant. It just doesn't make any sense. But the reality is that ancient Persia, well, we're going through the notes really fast, maybe it won't be a long talk. The reality is that ancient Persia was very divided, especially as cultures go. It was extremely divided. It is through that division that the nation evolved. There was a very thriving population of nomadic people that were Persians from an earlier time, and they lived primarily in the north. Alongside of them was a very settled agricultural community that was just beginning to develop, and it was mostly in the south. And eventually it produced a very rich culture, which we can still find in our agriculture to this day. Next to China, Persia is the source of more different cultivars of fruits and vegetables, but especially fruits that one finds anywhere in the world. Everything from melons to all kinds of cherries and apricots and things like that were developed by the ancient Persians. The people of the north, the nomads, were a fierce group of people, and they were disruptive, if not downright destructive, of the southern landed people. And Zarathustra served the king, and the king derived his kingdom from the southern people, from the landed people. In fact, there are even things in the Zend-Avesta that talk about some of the people were so wild that they were democratic, that they didn't have any leaders among them. To us, it seems a very funny notion. And so this is why modern scholars say that Zoroastrianism has the dualistic bias, because the destructive ones were the northerners, and they were associated with the forces of darkness and of evil and of destruction, which went against the forces of good and of light and against God. Now this division mind you, was a division within a common people under a common collective race spirit. That is, they all spoke common language, they had common tastes in food, common weights and measures, and all like that. And the cultural or racial spirit was modern seers find that most cultural or racial spirits are archangelic beings that overshadow an entire culture, and working primarily through language, but through all of the customs, bring people the specific lessons that they need. In this sense, a race or a culture is something like a tool that one incarnates into a given race or into a given culture to be guided specifically in certain channels so that certain kinds of lessons are experienced. And we're going to see as we go on that there were very definite Persian experiences that separated them from everybody else. Clearly, people were kept within that common spirit, and there was the spirit was such that there was something like the internal-external prejudices that we saw projected last time, that there were indeed prejudices about other peoples. However, those prejudices were prejudices that were more linguistic prejudices or even food prejudices than prejudices about color of skin or something like that. It is important that this kind of division takes place within ourselves. Probably the most important factor for our growth right now is the internal struggle that we have. And in that, the things that we don't want to do that seem to persist in us, that aren't tamed, or that have qualities of evil about them, or at least of retardation about them, are the things that are in some ways our greatest benefactors, because it is through that struggle that we wake up to our own power, and we wake up to our own freedom of choice about what we are and what we want to be. It is similar also with struggles within a group. That within any group, when there is a struggle, it is for the growth of the collective consciousness of each individual and the whole that is participating in that group. Now, dogs were very important to the ancient Persians. Steiner goes so far as to say that the ancient Persians had a complete dog mythology. We'll read from the Zendavesta later on and some of the things about dogs. In many regards, dogs were treated better than women. According to this, there was a gradated poll of dogs that went from north to south. That the northern dogs were actually more like wolves, wild and predatory, whereas the southern dogs were more likely to be mongrels or sycophantic pets or something like that. And the ideal dog was the protector or the herd dog or something that was serviceable, that had enough feral qualities and enough domesticated qualities. So you see that even in their attendant animals, that there was a quality of dualism and that there was a pole of different kinds of good and evil dogs. It's a very interesting kind of consciousness. They had a lot of prejudices about race, about language and things like that, and it permeated the whole society. This is the internal division that we alluded to last time when we said that Zoroastrianism grew up in an atmosphere of both internal and external division. So there was this kind of internal strife, and there was also an external division, though it wasn't so much fraught with warfare. The external division is relative in time and space and culture to ancient India. They shared a very similar language, but they did not share a common race or cultural spirit. What the northern nomads were to the southern, all of Persia was to the splendor that was ancient India at that time. If one wanted to psychologize, and I don't know how valid that is, one could say that a younger, more immature cultural expression would suffer the same feelings of inferiority that a younger child experiences relative to an older. Like a younger child cannot, because it's behind in the development cycle, it cannot compete with an older child, and it usually forges its own way, especially if there is something common between the two children, such as gender. A younger daughter relative to an older daughter, or a younger son relative to an older son, will usually be significantly different from the one that comes before, because it's the only way that it can maintain its own self-esteem. I don't know whether one can really psychologize in that way, but I find more all the time as life goes on that I study individual psychology, and I find that it really does apply to mass psychology or collective psychology, so I think there probably is a factor of this. There are no accidents. Children are born to a family in the order that they are born so that they can develop the way they need to develop. Very often the older child, when the younger differentiates itself, has to consolidate its character in what it is, and it becomes even more of a specialist of its development than it was before the younger came along, because that's the way it responds so that it can have its own security in the face of the fact that the younger one for a while is getting a lot more attention. And so it is fairly likely that perhaps in some way this was necessary for ancient Persia relative to India. And perhaps for the development of all of humanity it was necessary. Because what happens is, it's a common theme of old movies, that somebody comes up through the ranks and gets to a position of power and then becomes soft and decadent and corrupt, and there needs to be something new and fresh. And as wondrous as India was, in order for the progress of humanity, there needed to be something new. We even backbreed plants to wild hybrids so that we can get some vigor back in the plants so that they're not so subject to diseases or other qualities that have been lost in the process of specialization. So what Persia was to India, eventually Greece was to Persia. And eventually that's what the Roman society was to Greek society, and what German society was to Roman society. That there is almost like a following, like something cyclical, that one thing has to be on the up and coming stage while another thing is going into decadence. So the dualism of Zoroastrianism may have been in part a political reaction to internal nomadism, and it may have been a reaction to an external source in the culture of India. I doubt that any of these, that you can say that they are the real reason why dualism developed, though I think all of them are factors. That if we look at our own motivations of things, and start looking back at what we actually did and what came out of it, we find more and more that our lives are pretty complex. It isn't just a really simple thing, but there are all kinds of things that are in our makeup, and that the more sophisticated we become, or the more subtle we become, the more factors we have that are behind what we do. And that might in itself be a reason why within ourselves we need to burst out and have completely new directions of action to keep us from having so many complicated things like that. Zend is the language of the Avesta, which is the primary, the very first scripture of Zoroastrianism, and it is very similar to Sanskrit, which is the language of the Vedas. I don't know, Chard will have to tell me. The word Zend means interpretation, and in Avesta means sacred text or sacred meaning. So Zend Avesta means an interpretive language of sacred meaning. Is it fair to say that the word Sanskrit could almost be taken as Zenskrit in a similar way, that the script being the same root word as our word script or scripture? Is the sans part of Sanskrit interpretive, or what is its meaning?
Sanskrit means cultivated, polished culture.
Okay, it's not greatly dissimilar. That the cultivation would be what I'm looking for. For a long time, it was thought that Zend was an offshoot from Sanskrit, which was considered the first of the Indo-European languages, which some people call the Aryan languages and which some people call the post-Atlantean languages. The Persians called them the Aryan languages. But they didn't call them languages, they called it the Aryan philosophy. In fact, we're going to run into that in a little bit. The scholars eventually, and I think it was in the early part of the 19th century that there was the first documents of the Zend Avesta actually came into Western hands. But as scholars over the decades have begun to study, they have found that there are a lot of words that are independent in Zend that are not in Sanskrit. And they began to find that these words were equally ancient. And this was capitalized on by various people. There are a group of people that are called the Central Asiaists, I guess you could call them, that believe that the real Garden of Eden was in Central Asia, and that the idea that the Garden of Eden was in the Mideast is a Johnny-come-lately idea, and that all of those are copycat, revisionist imposters. I lent Bob a book, Don a book on that very subject. You have that book yet?
What's that book?
That book that tries to demonstrate the fact that the Garden of Eden was in Central Asia. And they try to do it by shapes of faces and names of people that are in the Bible and things like that, and tracing them to antecedents in Central Asia. No, I lent it to you out of the...
What was the title?
Oh, don't ask me anymore. But it was out of the lending library from the undershelves in the other room. But we'll get the
Undershelves in the other room?
Yeah, that's right. Don't worry about it. But at any rate, the Central Asiaists saw this as a vindication of the fact that everything originated in Central Asia rather than India. To some extent, the India scholars exist, and the Central Asia scholars exist, but as the decades have gone further on, linguists and cultural anthropologists have come to the point where they now believe that Zend and Sanskrit both derived from a more primal language, because that's the only way things could have developed. Now, you'd think that this would solve the problem, but all it does is it pushes it back another level. The Indiaists believe that perhaps there was a primary language that was before Zend and Sanskrit, but it was in India, and and that there really was no Aryan invasion, and that it developed in India, and then it was exported as Zen, and Sanskrit is a modern modification. Of course, the Central Asiaists believe that it developed in Central Asia and is not the product of Mother India, and that it was exported to both Persia and India. What? Yes, modern India scholars are of that Mother India school. They get pretty violent about it almost in their arguments. Speaker is not without an opinion. Even though I'm not a scholar or a linguist, I agree with the mysteries tradition. That is that it developed in the post-Atlantean times in Shangri-La or Shambhala, which is not the Gobi Desert, but northeast of the Gobi Desert, somewhere between the Gobi and the Kamchatka. And that all of the migrations of the Indo-European people came from that source and not from others. This is based primarily on my part on experience, though the experience is not so completely clear that I can say it definitively. That I had an inward experience of the type where one sees how these things happened, and it blew me away. And what happens to me is I'm such a emotionally prone person that in the very few times in life that I get to the point where I can experience something inwardly, I get so excited and I blow it all and I lose the whole value of the experience. Among the words that are common to both Persia and India are the words asura, which in Persia is called ahura, and the devas. And now we have to look into one of those things of language. There are a lot of ambiguities in ancient languages that modern people don't like. Modern people like one word to mean one thing. When we talked several weeks ago about how creation proceeded from unity to duality to multiplicity, that followed a general pattern. Well, the same thing happens in languages. That in ancient languages, everything is run together. And it's run together in such a way that depending on how you divide words is the kind of meaning that you're going to get. And sometimes you can combine the meanings from the different way that words are divided, and you put them all together, and you have a general meaning about it. So Sanskrit and Zen are languages that can be broken up in different ways. The scriptures can be broken up in different ways. Of course, again, there are schools, and each school sometimes becomes exclusive and thinks that its way is the only way to partition the words, and that therefore this is the only meaning. Unfortunately, in the insecurity of people, it sometimes happens that we see a truth about something and we identify, because we do have a self-conscious awakening every time we understand the truth of something, we identify with that experience, and when we identify with it, we become egoistically attached to it. And then a school sets up, because we know that this is a true meaning, but they don't even use the word a, they use the true meaning, and very often people are concerned that other people can be so misled to break up the different words in different ways. We'll use the Sanskrit term first to get at the subject we're trying to get at. This is, again, all night. It's going to be all introduction and very little at the end. Asura is one of those words that could be broken up in different ways. For example, if you just break it up here, Asu means life of breath, the life that is within the breath. On the other hand, if you do the breaking here, Sura means divine being. Now, before the schools got too well established, these were both put together as a composite meaning of the scriptures, so that in the late Vedas and in the following Brahmanas, both were combined, and it was thought then that the Asura were divine beings of the divine breath. So both were put together. It says something to the effect that Prajapati produced the first divine beings from his breath. Now here comes the part where Eula's going to kill me again. Yeah, I get resurrected. The people I love the most try to always keep me in line because I need it. And it's painful. However, the breath that is spoken of when we're talking about the divine breath of the Asu and the Sura is not the breath one uses when one sings or when one speaks, unless one is lapetamane. The Brahmanas especially make it clear that it is the breath from the lower abdomen or from the groin. In short, Prajapati produced the first divine beings by breaking wind. The reason I bring lapetamane in, I actually have lapetamane's horoscope. Do you know what lapetamane was? Yeah. He was a man that he was the sensation of Europe. Great artists didn't draw as big a crowds as he did. What he would do is he would eat certain types of food, and on stage he would sit there, and by expelling air, he would play songs. And always his his final song was the Marseillaise, which brought the house down every time. He was considered a national treasure. Incidentally, I think he's got something like 6 or 7 planets in airy signs. I've got the horoscope somewhere. I use it in classes every now and then. Yeah. This is again one of those cases where very sacred things are often put in very gross or profane mythical manifestations. Sort of like what happens in the Metamorphosis, the divine transformation of the golden ass of Apuleius is put in a very ribald, animalistic sense. Or we know in the West that the tragedy of a murder of an innocent and perfectly pure, loving being by crucifixion is not what it appears to be on the surface. In fact, just this last week, Boyce was in the store, and he told me of something he heard from an interview or read from an interview of a little child that was 10 years old. I believe it was a little 10-year-old boy. And surprisingly, because this is something you'd expect from a 10-year-old girl, but the child was asked, what is a myth? And the child worked it over in his consciousness and said, a myth is something that's true on the inside, but false on the outside. And this is one of those cases that is like that. If Brahma, Prajapati, is beginning to manifest, and the picture that is given is that the head of Prajapati is still in Parabrahm. And para-Brahm is what we have been calling potential, the state between the ever-unknown absolute and what it could be. The head or the directive consciousness of Prajapati is still in that, you might say, theoretical creative mode of what could be, ifing or doing something of that nature. And with that kind of image, it's not at all surprised to say, this is the parallel to what the Egyptians say, that Re urinated out some of the gods, and in the case of Brahm, or Prajapati Brahm, it is a matter of blew them out as the divine breath. There's really nothing profane about it when you get to it. There's another property of the Indo-European languages, such that we've looked at before in the past, and we used the classic example of cleave, which is a root word, where the word means the same thing, a thing and the opposite of that thing. That is, we say we cleave something to separate it, or we say, as the Bible says, and a man cleaves to his wife. This is a case where the principle or the idea is still in that state of union, and depending on how you divide it into duality and then into multiplicity, the same root idea can be taken different ways. Now, in the Indo-European languages, even prefixes have opposite meanings, such that if we take the prefix a, that has opposite meanings. When we say something is on the move, we say something is afoot. The A in the afoot meaning the activating of it, or the making possible of it, or the making of it. On the other hand, we say if someone does not have any realization or any connection with the divine, we say they are atheistic, meaning to say that they are not with something, but without something, without God. Now, when we divide asura, as we have it divided here, it is also an interpretation of saying that it is a being without divinity. You can take it both ways. You can say it is a being with divinity from the divine breath, or it is a being without divinity. So in one word, we have three distinctly different meanings, or three distinctly different ways that we can get understandings by breaking it up. Now, from the times of the Vedas on, strangely enough, asura has taken this meaning to say without divinity. And it has increasingly become that way throughout the history of the Indian religion. And that brings us back to another theme that we have. Do we have disagreement with what's being said? No.
Should read more French.
Yeah.
The French, actually the English have reversed the French meaning, because the nannies teaching the little Mormon kids, it's good in part to mean. The kids made their own meaning because they were the kings. They took the words and turned them around. And this is the wall between, this is the English Channel.
Yeah, this happens.
Well, the English Channel in our books, because we're on the English side of the language.
Well, at any rate, I want to go on, because otherwise I'll lose my pace and we'll be here all night.
It depends on where civilization is rising and falling to. I mean, it's the opposite character of days, obviously, is in a just French-English subsection.
Yeah. So it's the French nannies that changed all of ancient India, but I don't want to go in. All right. I don't want to go into a whole bunch of that. This brings us to, I'm trying to get to a place. It brings us to a theme that we've looked at several times before in the last 8 years, and that is the theme of war in heaven. Last year, we spent a significant amount of time talking about the war in heaven that took place in what in Western mysticism is called the moon period, the creative period that preceded the period that we are now living in. In that period, the cosmos was no more dense than the ethers or a magnetic field, and at that time we were at an earlier stage of our development. We were animal-like, and the beings that are now the angels were human-like. And we talked about what happened at that time, that some of the angels preferred to be near the nucleus of etheric creative activity. They liked the warmth of creative love that was making the creation possible and sustaining it. They liked it so much that they did not circulate out into the cooler regions of the general evolution of the solar cosmos, which was shaped very much different than it is now. And as a consequence, they became specialists, and as specialists, they became weak. And they became so weak that in their struggle to prove themselves supreme, they were arrogant, haughty, creative types of humans, or humans of that type, and they fell. And they became known as the brightest of the angels that eventually became dull and fell as the Lucifer spirits who could only bring false light. Now that war in heaven was a horizontal war in heaven, because both the part of the then humans, now angelic life wave, that was Luciferic, and that part which became angelic, were equals. They had the same kind of evolutionary development, the same kind of past history. In the past, we've talked about other wars in heaven, and we've talked about vertical wars in heaven. Several years ago, when we talked about Greek mythology, we talked about two such vertical wars. The first was when Kronos and the Titans overcame Kronos' father, Uranus, and castrated him. That is, took away his creative power and his creative agency. We spent even more time talking about how in the succeeding generation, Zeus and the gods, with the aids of the Cyclops and the giants, overcame Kronos and the Titans, and those that weren't slaughtered were penned up. And we concluded at that time, in a very simple, practical way, something that is true, that a creative being or a hierarch, to come into its own, must close itself off from that which preceded it. It is true that we all, like in our earliest childhood, learn by emulating our parents, or we learn a musical style by copying what another musician does. But if we want to come into our own creative right, we must cut ourselves off from, or we must shut off the influence of someone who is greater than us, because if we're looking at them all the time, something like a cosmic inferiority complex comes about, and we can't come into our own creatively. This is a psycho-spiritual creative principle. And sometimes the break is very violent. I had somebody that was in my life that was a mentor, a spiritual mentor type of person, and in order to come into my own, I had to throw off that person's influence, and it was not at all pleasant. Now, this same war in heaven, vertical war in heaven, is found in Hindu mythology. Instead of it being the gods struggling with the older titans, it is the devas struggling with the older asuras. And this is where asura came to mean without divinity, because they were penned up, or they were seen as evil beings, for the same reason that fixed stars are seen as almost all the fixed stars. If you look through the ancient charts of fixed stars, they're all almost seen as malefic, because the creative power is so great that to us that it is an overwhelming, destructive kind of agency, because we don't know how to respond to it positively yet. So we look at it as asura, without divinity, without evil. And the outcome was the same, in that the devas became divine helpers and the asuras became inimical. It's really amazing how beautiful all of these mythologies echo each other. You know, if mythology is indeed the language of the divine, it's not surprising that it's the same divine that the same myths should come out. And it's really even more interesting when we look at, there's yet another meaning for asura. There are yet lower asuras than those that struggled with the devas. And strangely enough, their character, there are two uses of titans. Titans meaning the creative hierarchy that is beyond the gods, and that on another sense there was a lower use of the word titans that meant Lucifer's spirits. We saw that when we looked at the myth of Zagreus about 7 or 8 years ago. And we looked at it several times since then. The same way, there is the same usage for asuras. That's all. These are all just a little asides. When we come to Persian mythology, the asuras are seen as ahuras. However, for the Persians, the ahuras are the divine beings, and the devas are the inimical beings. Now that brings up all sorts of interesting questions. One would wonder whether if there was indeed a primal culture that came before India or Persia, did the Persian culture separate before receiving the understanding about the war in heaven? I doubt that. I really very seriously doubt that. Or it might be a compensation. Again, this might be a factor. It's a minor factor, but in the same way, a child gets pushed around by a stronger or bigger child or a more developed child, and it says, my dad can beat your dad. And it's perfectly believable that this could have been an influence in Persian consciousness, that in order to maintain, again, some kind of self-esteem, they had to say that the asuras that were before the devas really are the divine beings, and it's like saying, my dad is stronger than your dad. I really think that some of those things might be factors, but probably there's something else that is going on. Psychological principles, usually because they are primarily psychological, are limited. And while they may be a factor in cultural development, they aren't a primary or really strong factor. It is said in the New Testament of the Bible that the angels ascend and descend on the Son of Man. And it's said it's averred in the Old Testament that the angels climb up and down Jacob's ladder. And what we're trying to get at here is that the rungs on Jacob's ladder are the same whether one is ascending or descending, because they represent various objective states within our very being. Now this is, even though we're still doing all introduction tonight, this is a very important principle. For example, without the guidance of the divine spirit, which is alluded to as gods, we're all like Odysseus. Without that divine guidance, we've got to use our wits. Similarly, if we want to give our emotions full birth, we have to stop the censoring mind, which would always hold back the emotions. And in a similar way, if we want to experience life and feeling without being cramped and tired, sort of like in Tai Chi, we have to get rid of the desire principle. These are means of descending Jacob's ladder, or these are ways of relating to the hierarchs, so that the Devas could not become the divine beings unless they had made the Asuras inimical beings. And we could not come into a relaxed flow of energy unless we made desire inimical. If we want to climb Jacob's ladder, the same principle is there. If we want to curb a vegetative life, we have to transcend that to a life of feeling and a life of emotion. Just in the same way that the desire body of an animal stops it from growing at a certain age. A plant which has no desire nature will grow and grow and grow, and it has that peaceful plant-like vegetative quality. We could even apply this to different kinds of insanity if we wanted to. And in a similar way, if we want to get beyond a desire nature where we're all caught up in our desires, we have to go to the controlling mind. Or, if we want to get beyond the mind with all of its back and forths, is it this way or is it that way, we have to transcend to the universal spirit. So the same principle works, and it's a very practical principle. That is, if we are dealing with our emotions and doing so unsuccessfully and they're running away on us, we have to bring in the mind. Or, if we are stunted in our emotional growth, we have to cease from hypermental activity and let the emotions flow. And trust the desires and trust that motivation that works in us is a realm in itself, and that it has a purpose in itself, and that it is divine. It's probably one of the simplest applications of the understanding of the spiritual worlds relative to each other that we can apply in our daily lives with wonderful success. I recommend, if you get nothing else out of the whole year's worth, then that one idea, it's a good thing. Similarly, if one needs to rejuvenate by starting a whole new culture for humanity to work through, to do something new and something different, one may have to transcend from the very peaceful ways, from the acceptance that it comes with an established society, because you've got all of this wealth and you've got a luxuriance of life, and you have to have a really strong desire nature. And if the devas are associated with the angelic beings and asuras with the astral beings, it's not surprising then that the temper and the work that the Persians had to do required them to have the ahuras as very high beings. All right, we're just about ready to get back to Zen, Avesta, and dualism. The highest and most central of the divine beings in Zoroastrianism was Ahura Mazda. The adversary, Ahura Mazda, let's see, I've got it written down here, which means divine light. Mazda is light, Ahura is divinity, as we just saw. So Ahura Mazda means divine light. The adversary to Ahura Mazda is Angra Mainyu, which in translation basically means evil spirit. The Angra is a word that means evil. The son of Ahura Mazda is called Spenta Menu, which in translation roughly means Holy Spirit. And we're going to see various variations in Zoroastrianism. Spenta Menu eventually became so identified with Ahura Mazda that it became the embodiment of the Father, and it very much in the same way that Horus that we looked at when we looked at Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Horus became the representative of Osiris. It became that was the central central being. Well, we're going to now read the creation story from the Zend-Avesta, which is really hard reading because they have words in there that, it's worse than trying to read Russian for all of the consonants in it. Ahura Mazda spoke unto Spitama Zarathustra, saying, I have made every land dear to its people, even though it had no charms whatever in it. Had I not made every land dear to its people, even though it had no charms whatever in it, then the whole living world would have invaded Ariana Vago. The first in good lands which I, Ahura Mazda, created was Ariana Vago by the Vayu Daikya. Boy, don't trust my pronunciations here because these are really tough words. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who was all death, and he counter-created the serpent in the river and winter, a work of the Devas. There are 10 winter months there and 2 summer months. And we think we've got it bad here. And those are cold for the waters, cold for the earth, cold for the trees. Winters fall there, the worst of plagues. The second of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the plain which the Sugdhas inhabit. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who is all death, and he counter-created the locust, which brings death unto cattle and plants. The third of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the strong holy Mouru. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who is all death, and he counter-created plunder and sin. The fourth of the good lands which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the beautiful Bhaktihidi, with high-lifted banners. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who was all death, and he counter-created the ants and the anthills. The fifth of the good, only a gardener would appreciate the ants and the anthills, which in central India are really pretty bad. The fifth of the good, the gobi ants they're said to even take on camels. They're that bad. Go ahead. The fifth of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was Nisaya, that lies between Moru and Bhaktidi. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who was all death, and he counter-created the sin of unbelief. The sixth of the good lands which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the house-deserting Haroyu. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who was all death, and he counter-created tears and wailing. The seventh of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was Vaikarita, of evil shadows. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who was all death, and he counter-created Pairikat Kanafati, I don't know how to pronounce it right, who clave unto Karisapa, the eighth of the good lands. Which were thereupon Angra Mainyu, who was all death, created that. All right. The eighth of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was Urva of the rich pastures. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who is all death, and he countercreated the sin of pride. The ninth of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was Kentna, which the Barikanas inhabit. Thereupon came Andromeda, who is all death, and he countercreated a sin for which there is no atonement, the unnatural sin. The 10th of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the beautiful Harabati. Thereupon came Andromeda, who is all death, and he countercreated a sin for which there is no atonement, the burying of the dead. The 11th of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the bright, glorious Hetumat. Thereupon came Andromeda, who is all death, and he countercreated the evil work of witchcraft. And it just goes on and on. There are 16 creations and 16 counter-destructions. It's not the sort of thing that will win a Nobel Prize for poetry or literature. And it's certainly not the best example of diversified presentation. No hint is made in it in this form, unless it's one of these things that you really have to ponder and know that there's something behind it when it's talking about the creation of different realms. All in all, it's pretty plain and it's pretty homely. Nonetheless, it is good for our purposes because it is a very definitive statement of dualism. One divinity creates, the other divinity destroys. Each is mutually exclusive. Each has its own sovereign domain and its own activity. When we're trying to understand dualism, especially the apparent dualism of apparent good and apparent evil, alternative is one of the things that we find as a function of dualism. Alternative as in those fairy tales, where the evil witch pronounces Sleeping Beauty has to sleep for all of these years. The alternative comes from the fairy godmother, who cannot undo the other curse, but she can offer an alternative, that she's going to wake up and marry a prince. So we have something here, we have two equal powers. A curse is made, but a blessing is given at the same time, and the blessing can't undo the curse, but it provides an alternative ending or an alternative outlook. What we just looked at here is so dualistic in one kind of dualism that it doesn't even have alternative. It's pure dualism. One creates, another destroys. There's alternation, but no alternative. There's alternation in everything. All mystical seers can see that there is a creative activity that is followed by an uncreating activity. Now, this kind of dualism could be called a reactive dualism. By that, it is meant that the destructive evil force can only destroy in reaction to what the good force has created. In short, there is an object. There are other forms of dualism. We're going to see them as we go along through the course during the course of the year. But in a reactive dualism, there is a common object of attention. One creates, one reactively destroys. The only thing that they have in common is that object. There are two poles. It doesn't say that there are two poles of the same thing, the creative and destructive forces. The only thing they ever have in common is the one objective, or the one object. Neither of the, as we saw in the creation story, neither of them is stronger than the other. One can create an object of attention, and another can destroy it, but there's nothing to say that one is stronger than the other. Eventually we'll follow Zoroastrianism further to see that is not quite true. These two facts pervade this kind of a dualism. Absence of a common origin and an apparent equality in might. And this equality and the absence of a common origin make this a horizontal dualism. If one were greater than another, then there would be a vertical dualism. We're going to go into that probably the next time. But there is a horizontal dualism. Each of these two beings is equal to the other. So the horizontal dualism is a dualism of equals. So we can be more precise now and say it is a reactive horizontal dualism. Now this is a very common outlook. We find it all the time. Like, for example, for people who believe that the material plane is all that there is, there's the notion that everything is made of the same stuff. Whether it's a dunghill or a flower or a mountain or whatever, it's all made of the same material stuff. Same particles go into the same atoms and such like that. This is the outlook that is common to science right now. Science postulates a matter and an antimatter that are equal to each other, and that when the two of them come together, that the creation or that the two universes, the matter universe and the antimatter universe, are both neutralized. This is a pretty common way of looking at things. Since materialists believe that emotions or feelings are a product of the interaction of matter and not a product of a willful activity, then even the thoughts and the emotions and the character of Ahura Mazda and Andhra Mainyu would just be the result of matter and antimatter, each having their own character from very complicated interactions of their matters or of their atoms or anti-atoms. Even in theology or philosophy, the idea of a reactive horizontal dualism is pretty common. A lot of people believe that God needs an antithesis to know itself. Another way of saying it is that there is no good without evil. And it is, in a strange way, the evil that keeps good honest. This is a very, very common view. There does, in the minds of people and in the cosmos, appear to be something true about this view. If we look, the very examples that are given in the Zendavesta, the struggle of summer and winter and life and death, are indeed a dualistic struggle. It seems that something is born and comes to birth, and then another force seems to come on with stronger in life, and something dies. The same thing is true with health and illness, that for every degree of health that we have or robustness we have, there is a kind of evil that comes along and cancels it out. So there are struggles. We see the left and the right, each with a different attitude, struggling for the same thing, the same material goods, the same power over people. It is a very apparent thing in the world. Even in our bodies, even right down to the cellular level, there are the forces that allow a cell to grow and propagate, that there are death-dealing forces right within each cell that at their time come on and they destroy the cell. So the idea of a horizontal dualism, a reactive horizontal dualism, seems to be true. Even in consciousness. Children at a certain age, I don't know if it's the age that corresponds to Persia in the post-Atlantean societies, but children at a certain age love to build things up, knock them down. Build things up, knock them down, and we have this constant alternating creation and destruction. Paul says there is another law in our members. In the struggle to do good or to not do evil, that it seems like it is a constant struggle. Sometimes we love, sometimes we do not, and we do mean and nasty things. Sometimes it seems as if a force beyond us comes through us and we do wondrous creative things. At other times it seems that we do things that are beneath us, that we wouldn't in our conscious mind at all do those things. And it seems like in the same way that there is a struggle in nature, or that there is a political struggle, there is the same kind of struggle in our consciousness that seems to go beyond our waking sphere of attention, where there is a creator and a destroyer right within us. Since it is two forces fighting for an object, two extremes trying to reach for a central object, this is an extremes over the means kind of dualism. So it's a pretty complicated kind of dualism. Now there's something appealing about this dualism in several ways. First of all, it is clean. There is a beauty even in destructiveness when something goes all out and gives totally itself to destroying something. If you look in the testimony of criminals, when they hear the objective facts of the case against them, they can't believe it, because they intended something else. I'm not saying this for all criminal cases, but they intended something else. And they were giving themselves to that objective such that that when the facts of the matter come out, or when the form of the experience comes out, it is very much unlike their intent. Even struggle has a cleanliness like that. Like football is like that. People try to knock each other around and try to harm each other, and they think this is a good thing to do, to blow them out of the way. In fact, it even goes so far as to say that if you don't give yourself fully, and if you're thinking of yourself and hold back, that's when you injure yourself. But if you give yourself totally, you're clean. There is, in fact, if you look at it in a Baroque way, there is a beauty to ugliness. And there's a beauty to death. This appeal is even there theologically. And this gets us to something that we're going to look at quite a bit. This view of a horizontal extremes over the means reactive dualism is a way of sidestepping theodicy. Theodicy is the term which means the metaphysical relationship with divinity to evil. I'll give it to you in a really simple statement, the most common statement of it. If God is God and God is good, then why is there evil? Either God is not thoroughly God, or God is not thoroughly good. This is the statement of this kind of dualism. Meaning to say, that if God is all omnipotent, and God is at the same time all beneficent, then why is there evil at all? Is evil a good thing? Either God is thoroughly, to see people suffer in illnesses or to be harmed in crime or warfare, that can't be good, then why does God allow it? Either God is not omnipotent or God is not good. That's the way the question comes out. Now you have to be careful of things like this, because the way the statement of theodicy is placed, it is placed in a question. And it's placed in a question that is itself dualistic, and that assumes dualism in it. And this makes it very tricky and very hard to deal with. It's something like one of those unanswerable questions. Let's see, what's the most common one? It's the metaphysical version of answer yes or no. Have you stopped beating your dog yet? If you say yes, it means that you have been beating your dog, and if you say no, you're still beating the dog. This statement, if God is God and God is good, then why is there evil, is of that nature to some extent. The answer of the horizontal dualist that we have seen that completely sidesteps this altogether is that God is good and God is God. That is to say, God is so much God and so much good that it doesn't have anything to do with evil. If there's evil out there, it's no fault of God's. And God is so good that God can't even get into evil. Eventually we'll see that this turns out to be a very positive thing if taken in the right way. So this is something that God has nothing to do with non-being or with active non-being, which is what you could call destructive or what you could call evil. There's something extremely Zen-like in this, in the doing and the not doing. It's really, in a way, it's theologically comforting to know that God is good, and because it's logically consistent. However, in terms of total reality, it's a little unsettling. It's unsettling because you don't know what is the place of the divine in the total relative to the evil. So it sort of, in a way, sort of ignores it. Even if one is not thoroughly identified with the good and maintains this kind of dualism, one can develop an apathy. And that's basically, that's a very common philosophy right now. Even if one is not trying to be a good person, but is in a realm where good is happening and evil is happening, and doesn't want to identify either way, you can always say shit happens. And that's a statement of dualism. There is a good, that doesn't mean that something evil isn't going to happen at the same time. It's, and for some people, in a very clever way, it's a nice way to say, well, shit happens. Except when it's your kid that gets run over or something like that. Then it becomes something a little bit more serious. Even on the microcosmic level, in the unity of our own being, this kind of dualism becomes very unsettling. Because if the extremes over the means horizontal reactive dualism is reality, then what is the meaning of our personal existence? Our personal existence is merely an experience of an interaction between creative and destructive forces. That means everything we are is an experience and nothing more. And even my philosophizing about this or trying to spiritually inquire into that is part of the experience and nothing more. There's no self. There's no, it's clean of self. Now that's really appealing. In fact, there are a lot of very profound schools of spiritual study that say just this, that there is no self. What we call self is an interaction of different forces with each other. And when they dissolve, there will, that's the end of it. Yeah. You're the anticipator. Because you're getting to right now where I'm going. It doesn't satisfy all of our experience. As clean as it is, either on a personal level or on a universal level, if it's clean of selfhood, it's also clean of responsibility. We're not responsible. We're just an interaction of forces. These things follow logically. It also then means that conscience has no real meaning, because conscience is part of the experience. And it isn't even on the level or in the same ballpark as an indulgence in guilt. This means that what we call intuition, or what we call creativity, or the freedom to choose the good or the evil, the creative or the destructive, all of those have no meaning. They're just part of the experience. They're part of the interaction of the God creative force and the anti-God destructive force. Dualisms are extremely polar. Because of that, they have all of the irony of polarity. At the same time that we have a very secure and satisfying view that God is good and perfect, we have at that same time a very unsettling and insecure view. Dualisms, because they have this polarity, are linear. And because they're linear, they're of the mind. And dualism is an extremely mental philosophy. And because they are so much of the mind, so much of the head, they do not have heart. But we do have heart. We do have conscience. We do have responsibility. We have freedom. We have creativity. We have intuitions. That's part of our whole existence. At this point, there's a temptation to say, well, why don't I then just, if I have this freedom and such, intuitiveness, creativity, responsibility, why don't I just choose to freely and purely identify with the good? But then once you've realized this, then you recognize that if you do that, you're just like Angrameño. You're you're the kind of person that, hey, I'm a great person and I don't have to help that person across the street who's getting beat up. You see what I mean? It's a really, really difficult thing. Once we have accepted the fact that we do have an attention that spans alternations, it's no longer really a clear dualism, but we can see things in terms of progress. We can see that there's something linear, and we can see that there's something that goes beyond the dualistic divisions. But if we try to give ourselves totally to that which is beyond that, we again do not have a full experience. It is valuable to use mental dualistic ends, to enter into that mode. If we need to be adventurous, if we need to explore, if we need to do something completely new and different, it's good. If we need to participate in something in a linear progressive development, clean from any hitch of saying, well, is this right? It's a good kind of thing. If we need to detach, if we need to get a clear mental understanding about what's at stake, it's good to have a dualism, to weigh all of the different sides. However, in our consciousness, we must not allow ourselves in such an instance, if we enter into the dualistic mode, we must not enter in so completely that we enter into it and are locked into that view of things. Because you see what happens. Once you're locked in that view of things, then there is no, the powers of good and the powers of evil are all equal, or that the creator and the destroyer are all equal and you can't do anything. It's no different than saying that if you go right back to the first drawing that we had here of the two squares linked together by diagonals, it's no different than saying that this is a bird's eye view of a pyramid looking from the top down, or if we get stuck and look at it as a chute where we're looking at something that is indented down. When you shift a perspective such that you only see things from one way, you're locked in that. And you have to let go of one perspective to shift to the other. If we enter purely into dualistic consciousness, where there is this side and there is that side, then we are locked in that perspective and we can't see it as a pyramid again. Once we're looking at it as a chute until we let go and shift perspective. Now, obviously, there is something more holistic, something more total about the perspective of the heart. And we'll explore that at another time. But it is clear one cannot enter into a heart-like position or into a position of freedom or such that one refuses to use the mind, or one will become somebody that is blissed out with no appreciation for all of the little minutiae that are going on, which are in themselves miniatures of the general creative activity that we're part of. So, if we get locked in this perspective, we have the certitude of God is good. Or perhaps that God is evil. And there are people that get into that because it's all the same. That derives from the mental reality. And there is a security and an insecurity at the same time. Because when you start looking at this, if you think about it, if you extrapolate it to the largest metaphysical sense, then maybe even the whole of creation may be just a very big complex situation of a creation that is about to be destroyed, and there really is no meaning, and there is no selfhood, there is no creative freedom in it all. It's you're just seeing one side of something that alternates. It's a very tricky business. From my own personal experience, I have found that when I enter into purely mental mode, I do not make decisions. I do not make decisions at all. I can see a reason for doing this, I can see a reason for doing that. I had to be trapped into marriage, because otherwise I probably never would have been trapped into marriage. I probably never would have gotten married. I dithered over it. I dithered and dithered and dithered over it, and I couldn't come to a conclusion. But the trap was that I came to my feelings. And when I came to my feelings, I knew what was important to me. And I have, by watching this over the years, I think that one can amass all sorts of informations in being in horizontal dualistic mode. But as much as the mentalists would try to tell you that if you have all the facts, it's easy to make a decision, decisions are made from the heart, they're made from the intuition, they're made from the feelings, and they're not made from a dualistic mode, because everything is neutral in a dualistic mode and you can't come to any conclusion in any which way. So the thing is, we're right back to where we started a few weeks ago when we said that when you're involved with this, we even have a dualism about dualism. Whether one follows the more whole way of the heart or whether one follows the way of mental dualism, even that there has to be some kind of balance. And always, as long as one is consciously dealing with it, relative to an unknown, relative to what we're all progressing toward but not really fully knowing, there is a kind of cosmic unsurety or a kind of cosmic insecurity, and in some way we have to make a gesture of love. We have to make a gesture of creativity because of the uncertainty we never would know. We have to speak that primordial word. However, what orifice we speak it out of, I'm not so certain about. That's about it for tonight. My goodness, it did end up being less than 90 minutes. Yes? That comes later on. Yes. That comes from Mazdism. Ahura Mazda becomes Orzmad, and Angra becomes Ahriman. Okay, yeah, we're talking. We got a long way to go yet. We got about 3 or 4 kinds of dualism to look into. Yeah.
Is the objective here then to not have dualism, to just...
No. The objective is to recognize the reality of dualism as a component within the reality that we live in, the total reality, but to avoid being stuck in it, as appealing and unappealing as it may be. Because what happens is, if you are of a personality type, or if you make the choice to become a mentalist, you're going to be stuck in that.
But if you accept dualism, it means you're accepting judgments, and you're making judgments, and...
Not necessarily. You're completely free of judgment. You just, there isn't really a judgment in shit happens.
No, but you're saying, in a judgment, though, you are saying this is good, this is evil.
Well, you can also say
or you
appropriate.
Yeah, you can say that this is pro-life and this is anti-life. It doesn't have to be a personal judgment.
No.
It can be an observation of the facts. That's the really good thing about dualism. It is an observation of the fact that if I inject myself with this, my body will die. That's a fact. And that's where dualism is clean. But it's so clean that it can't come to a conclusion. A mental dualist could very easily get into killing people, because it doesn't make any difference. They're not serving evil. How does Macbeth say of Lady Macbeth when he's given the news that she's died or killed herself? He says she would have died anyway. Yeah.
You should have turned in back alive this afternoon and watched this acupuncturist destroy these 2 doctors. By using their own logic, you would have seen appropriate judgment rendered there. They killed themselves with their own comments. They couldn't help but stick their feet into their mouth every time they opened it. And it went on for hours. I tape it. It's glorious. It's one of the greatest lessons in destruction of dualism I've ever seen.
So is that a very early level of the mind then?
I think that is the very basic level.